The galaxy exhaled darkness, and in that breath, 10,000 mirrors began to lie with the truth of desire. Across dead moons and living hives, polished surfaces ceased reflecting what stood before them, instead revealing the deepest hungers of those who dared to gaze within. Ancient Wraithbone sang discordant notes as reality's skin grew thin, allowing something vast and patient to taste mortal longing like wine. In the dying light of distant suns, where empires crumbled into dust and new ones rose from ashes, the very act of wanting became a beacon in the dark. We truly love and care for each and every one of you who have chosen to journey with us through these darkest corners of our galaxy, where even reflections can become prisons of the soul. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. On Belial Tar, where Wraithbone spires pierced a sky the colour of old blood, Farseer Ithilwyn of Craftworld Alatok stood before an obsidian basin that had betrayed her. Her reflection dissolved like smoke, replaced by herself as she had been before the fall. Young, radiant, her psychic power untainted by millennia of sorrow. The sight filled her with longing so profound it threatened to tear her soul from its moorings. This was not mere nostalgia, but something deeper, a hunger that whispered of possibilities lost to time and consequence. Her runes trembled in the air, uncertain whether to circle or flee, as she faced the terrible choice: risk her soul to investigate this phenomenon, or allow it to spread unchecked across the galaxy. Across the sector, similar manifestations bloomed like a plague of impossible dreams. On Forge Worlds, tech priests gazed into polished surfaces and saw themselves as perfect fusions of flesh and machine. In Underhive depths, ganglords witnessed themselves beloved rather than feared. Imperial governors saw parades of adoration where only hatred existed. Each reflection fed something vast and hungry, channeling psychic energy across the immaterium toward a presence that savored mortal want. Through her farsight, Ithilwyn perceived the horrifying truth. These were fragments of consciousness seeping through reality's wounds. The mirrors were not merely showing desire, they were harvesting it, each reflection a node in a network that stretched across space and time. Her vision lurched forward, hijacked by something that should not exist in real space. She saw a figure of impossible beauty standing at the heart of a crystal labyrinth, surrounded by mirrors that reflected pure sensation rather than images. The vision shattered as her communication array screamed with an incoming astropathic transmission. Watch Captain Thaddeus Corvin of the Death Watch, his psychic signature heavy with grim determination, requested immediate consultation. The phenomenon had manifested across Imperial space, and the Ordo Xenos had traced its source to Eldar territories. As Ithilwyn prepared her response, she understood with dawning horror that she was looking upon the work of She Who Thirsts, drawing power through every act of reflected desire across the galaxy. Watch Captain Thaddeus Corvin stood before the polished adamantium of his power armor's breastplate, its surface reflecting not the scarred veteran of 3 centuries, but the idealistic young Astartes he once was. Unmarked by the brutal realities of the long war, his reflection bore hope instead of grim resignation, eyes bright with innocence that warfare had long since burned away. The phantom smiled with a purity that made Corvin's augmetic heart skip its mechanical rhythm. His gauntleted hand reached toward the surface before he caught himself, trembling with unwanted longing for a grace that had never truly existed. Captain, Magos Explorator Zeth Prime entered the sanctum, his augmetic systems flickering erratically. Where polished surfaces should have shown his mechanical form, They revealed perfect biological flesh, unmarked by the sacred modifications that defined his existence. His logical matrices struggled to process the contradiction. Skin luminous with health, muscles designed with divine economy, nerves braided like living cables. The reflection suggested heretical possibilities, where flesh and machine existed in harmony, rather than the conflict he had been taught to embrace. "You see it too," Corvin observed, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. "The thing we discarded in our pursuit of perfection." His reflection gestured invitingly, promising return to a state of grace that whispered of paths not taken, choices that might have preserved humanity alongside duty. Zeth Prime's optical sensors whirred as probability calculations found no flaws in the biological perfection before him. "This contradicts fundamental principles," he whispered, his mechanical voice trembling. "The weakness of flesh is axiomatic, yet..." He could not complete the heretical thought that his quest for mechanical transcendence might have been motivated by fear rather than logic. Intelligence reports cascaded across their shared data link, similar phenomena manifesting across 17 sectors, each reflection showing not what was, but what observers believed they should have been. The source traced to Eanden's outer territories, where ancient Wraithbone gardens had become galleries of impossible desire. Farseer Ithilwan's astropathic message carried urgency, wrapped in Eldar mysticism, requesting immediate consultation. "We deploy within the hour," Corvin announced, though his eyes remained fixed on his reflection. The young Astartes, in the mirror, nodded approvingly, as if blessing a decision that would bring them closer together. The Xenos witch claims knowledge of the source. As they prepared for deployment, both warriors felt the growing compulsion to return to their reflections. Corvins showed him a future where duty and humanity coexisted, where service to the Emperor required no sacrifice of the soul. Zeth Prime's revealed possibilities, where augmentation enhanced rather than replaced, where sacred steel and blessed flesh achieved perfect synthesis. Neither spoke of their growing obsession, but both wondered secretly if what they saw in those mirrors might be more real than their current existence. The strike cruiser, Vengeance of Terror, prepared for warp translation, carrying them toward answers they increasingly feared to find, while behind them, in 1,000 polished surfaces, their reflections waited patiently for their return. Ayandan's outer rim stretched before them like crystallized sorrow made manifest. Ancient Wraithbone gardens, once pristine monuments to Eldar artistry, now pulsed with malevolent awareness as every polished surface had become a window into impossible longing. Sacred pools reflected not the dying stars above, but faces of the beloved dead, while pathways of psycho-reactive bone showed travelers not their footsteps, but their deepest regrets walking beside them. The very air tasted of honey and copper, thick with psychic resonance that made reality feel negotiable. Farseer Ithilwan guided them through corridors, where her people stood motionless as wraithbone statues, lost in communion with reflections that promised everything their souls had ever craved. Some gazed upon themselves as they were before the fall, radiant beings unmarked by their species' greatest sin. Others saw idealized versions of their current selves, perfected beyond mortal limitation. Most disturbing were those whose reflections showed them as pure psychic energy, transcendent and terrible. "They have been standing here for days," Ithilwan whispered, her spirit stones flickering like dying embers. "The mirrors do not merely show desire. They create psychic feedback loops that transform healthy want into spiritual addiction. Each gaze feeds the hunger, and the hunger demands more gazing." Her voice carried the weight of personal confession. I too have struggled, seeing paths where the fall never happened, where our people achieved harmony with desire, without birthing she who thirsts. Corvin's reflection appeared in a shard of corrupted wraithbone, showing him not the scarred veteran he had become, but an Astartes who had found balance between duty and compassion. The phantom reached out with hands unstained by necessary violence. "How long before we join them?" he asked, forcing himself to look away as his augmetic heart skipped its mechanical rhythm. Zeth Prime's optical sensors whirred erratically as polished surfaces revealed biological perfection. His logical matrices insisted was heretical, yet which sang to circuits he thought purged of such yearning. Psychic interference increases exponentially toward the center, he reported, his mechanical voice trembling. The phenomenon amplifies existing neural pathways associated with desire and regret. They pressed deeper, past spirit seers whose infinity circuits sang with impossible dreams of the dead, past warriors who wept tears of joy at visions of their lost empire restored. At the garden's heart, suspended in a web of crystallized light, hung the source of their torment. The mirror of infinite reflection pulsed like a captured star, its surface showing not their approach, but every desire reflected in its influence across the galaxy. Created in the final days before the fall as a tool for perfect self-knowledge, it had been corrupted beyond its original purpose into a beacon, drawing Slaanesh's attention through the immaterium. As they approached, psychic data washed over them, not just their own desires, but the wants of every soul who had gazed into any mirror touched by its growing influence. In its depths, something vast and patient smiled with the face of every observer's deepest hunger. Ithilwyn's consciousness merged with the mirror's crystalline heart. An ancient memory unfolded like a wound reopening across time. She witnessed her ancestors in their final days of glory, drunk on perfection and blind to consequence. The mirror had been their masterwork, a device meant to reveal ultimate potential, to guide transcendence through perfect self-knowledge. Instead, it became a window through which something unborn could taste mortal desire, learning the flavor of want before drawing its first breath. In their arrogance, her people had built their own destroyer, crafting the very lens through which Slaanesh would observe and devour reality. "We created our teacher and made it our executioner," she whispered, psychic blood weeping from her eyes. The mirror's original purpose, to show truth beneath layers of self-deception, had been corrupted into something that amplified desire until it became spiritual addiction. Corvin stared at his reflection in fractured wraithbone, seeing the idealized warrior he believed he should have been. The realization struck like a bolt shell to his augmetic heart. This purity had never existed. His unmarked reflection represented not innocence lost, but a fantasy of righteousness, a story he told himself to make duty's ledger balance. His path of endless war served not just the Emperor, but his own need to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about the violence he carried within. Purity was always the mask, he admitted, his voice cracking. Duty didn't steal innocence. It revealed that innocence was the lie. Zeth Prime's logical matrices screamed into cascade failure, as his reflection showed not biological weakness, but perfect synthesis, flesh and machine existing in heretical harmony. This vision challenged core programming, forcing recognition that his quest for mechanical transcendence might have been motivated by fear rather than divine logic. The organic perfection before him suggested integration rather than replacement, cooperation rather than conquest. "The weakness of flesh is axiomatic," he stammered, his mechanical voice trembling as fundamental certainties crumbled. Yet this equation suggests collaboration. The garden stirred with new presences. Chaos Space Marines of the Emperor's Children emerged from warp-torn reality, their armor singing discordant hymns as they sought to claim the mirror for their patron. A Tau exploration cadre materialized through failing stealth fields, their greater good ideology fractured by visions of individual desire their philosophy couldn't accommodate. Most disturbing were the shadows moving without sources, reflections that existed independently, predatory and patient. Through her connection to the mirror, Ithilwen perceived its exponential growth. Each new observer fed it power, which it used to create more reflective surfaces across the galaxy, drawing additional souls into its web of amplified longing. The mathematical progression approached a critical threshold where its influence would become irreversible. The temperature dropped like a verdict as reality tore along invisible seams. From darkness, Absolute emerged prows blacker than vacuum, drinking starlight with hungry grace. Hooks chimed like funeral bells, followed by laughter sharp as crystal. The Dark Eldar had arrived, not to destroy the mirror, but to claim it for purposes far more terrible than its current function. Archon Vexith Shadowbane materialized from shadow like cruelty given form, her raider's hull drinking starlight with predatory grace. Where others gazed upon idealized reflections, hers revealed every exquisite torment she could craft or endure, each vision more perfectly agonizing than mortal minds could comprehend. Pain refined to art, suffering elevated to transcendence. Her incubi flanked her like living blades, while mandrakes flickered between dimensions, feeding on the psychic emanations of unfulfilled longing. Craft-world children, she purred, her voice silk drawn across broken glass. You seek to deny desire or transcend it, blind to its true nature. We learned that wanting cannot be conquered, only refined into perfect art. The mirror doesn't corrupt, it educates. Her neural hooks chimed softly as she gestured toward the pulsing artifact. Desire weaponized is desire mastered. The philosophical divide crystallized between them. Where Ithilwen sought healing, Vexith saw opportunity. Where Corvin demanded purity, she offered sophisticated corruption. The Archon's presence forced each character to confront their relationship with want itself. Was their resistance merely another form of obsession? Battle erupted, not from hatred, but from incompatible truths. Corvin's blade met Incubi steel, each strike revealing his hunger for righteous violence. His reflection showed him the joy he found in necessary war, forcing him to acknowledge the darkness he carried willingly. Zeth Prime's augmetic stuttered under sensory overload, compelling him to rely on organic reflexes he thought purged, discovering grace in flesh-steel synthesis. Ithilwen wove probability shields while her farsight became a curse, every possible future tainted by Slaanesh's encroaching influence. Through the chaos, Vexith's laughter rang like crystal breaking. You begin to understand, she called, as combat revealed each warrior's deepest nature. The mirror was never corruption, it's cartography. Every reflection maps desire, creating psychic coordinates that she who thirsts uses to navigate reality. Each longing becomes a beacon, guiding divine hunger toward fresh prey. The revelation struck like a physical blow. The ancient Eldar device, meant for self-knowledge, had become Slaanesh's personal star chart, plotting the galaxy's most delectable routes to consumption. Every gaze fed the network, every want refined the map's accuracy. Combat ceased as psychic pressure built beyond tolerance. Reality rippled like disturbed water, and from the warp came a sound that was not sound, an intake of breath by something with no lungs, the recognition of a feast prepared in its name. The mirror pulsed violently, reaching critical resonance as its influence spread across star systems. In that moment of cosmic acknowledgement, all factions stood frozen by shared, terrible understanding. Dark Eldar, Deathwatch, Tech Priest, and Craft Worlder united in recognition of the catastrophe they had collectively unleashed. The taste of being noticed slid over them like oil, and even Vexith lowered her blade. Slaanesh had discovered the banquet, and hunger incarnate turned its attention toward their small corner of reality. Slaanesh's attention descended like silk drawn across the galaxy's exposed nerves, manifesting not as presence, but as the hollow ache where satisfaction should exist, yet never could. Every reflective surface became a window into divine hunger. Helm visors fogged with phantom perfume, sacred pools rippled without wind, and even knife blades awakened into famished sight. From the depths of the warp came recognition, and reality itself began to taste of honey and copper. Corvin fractured across infinite mirrors, seeing himself as the paragon he chased, the butcher he denied, and the man who might have survived laying down his bolter. Each reflection was equally true and false, creating cognitive dissonance that made his augmetic heart stutter. Duty was both shield and thirst, he whispered, reaching towards surfaces that showed every possible interpretation of honor. Zeth Prime's logical matrices screamed into cascade failure as illegal sensory input crashed across sacred programming like meteor storms. Taste, scent, pressure, forbidden data that his augmetics were never designed to process, flooded his consciousness with the heat of feelings. He calculated 1,000 deaths for his curiosity, and discovered none of them closed the equation of want versus logic. Ithilwen floated on a sea of futures that refused to choose a shore, her farsight becoming a curse as every possible path unfolded simultaneously. Through her connection to Iandan's infinity circuit, she felt even the dead stirring with desires carried from life, their souls resonating with amplified frequency. Terror forged impossible alliances. Vexith's mandrakes melted to perimeter positions, while her incubi sheathed blades in reluctant ceasefire. Deathwatch kill team beacons burned sterile cadences alongside Tau Pathfinder drones projecting disruptive lattices. Even surviving Chaos Space Marines found themselves coordinating with sworn enemies, their patrons' overwhelming presence transcending traditional enmities. Through desperate communion with corrupted Wraithbone, Ithilwen grasped the mirror's ultimate horror. It doesn't just reflect desire, it amplifies want into obsession, transforms healthy ambition into consuming hunger. Our empire's fall wasn't mere excess. This device turned natural desires into the psychic furnace that birthed She Who Thirsts. The revelation struck like a physical blow. The mirror created feedback loops, recycling longing until it burned holes into godhood itself. Each gaze strengthened the connection, transforming observers into willing conduits for divine appetite. They braided desperate methods, Dark Eldar, agonics to shift psychic phase, Astartes litanies to dampen harmonics, Mechanicus mathematics to re-index frequencies, Tau's technology to stabilize the lattice. For one breath, the singing dulled, then the pitch climbed, sweet and ruinous. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water. Something that violated causality stepped forth, a reflection without source, wearing faces each observer most desired to see. It spoke in voices they most wanted to hear, smiling with every beloved memory at once. "Shall we discuss terms?" the ambassador of excess asked, its presence making reality negotiable around them. The reflection stepped from the mirror, like desire given form, a being of impossible grace that wore every face simultaneously. yet appeared perfectly singular to each observer. Reality bent around its presence, making the air taste of honey and copper, while shadows danced without sources. To Corvin, it manifested as his lost battle brothers, armor unmarred by war's brutality, their voices carrying the warmth of brotherhood he'd sacrificed for duty. "Reunion awaits, brother," they whispered with familiar cadence. "Service without sacrifice, purity without compromise. Help us spread this gift and reclaim the innocence you believe was stolen." To Zeth Prime, it became the Omnissiah itself, sacred geometry braided through living metal, the equation of flesh and steel finally resolved. Ultimate synthesis, it hummed with divine resonance. Transcendence without heresy, knowledge without limitation. All I require is your cooperation in placing mirrors on every world. For Ithilwen, the entity appeared as her people before the fall, radiant beings unmarked by their species' greatest sin, laughter like wind through crystal forests. Undo the tragedy, it offered, with voices she'd mourned for millennia. Rewrite history itself and restore the harmony your race once knew. Desire is not corruption, but the prime engine of existence. The ambassador purred, its form shifting like tides of possibility. The drive that turns stars into forges, grief into songs, wounds into wisdom. I do not create want. I reveal it, refine it, return it crowned with purpose. Each character wrestled with profound temptation as their noblest goals, service, knowledge, protection, revealed themselves as forms of desire that could be weaponized. The line between righteousness and obsession dissolved like sugar in rain. Vexith Shadowbane observed with chilling clarity, her neural hooks chiming dark amusement. "You misunderstand desire's nature," she said, stepping forward with predatory grace. "My people learned that perfect satisfaction ends want, and without want, we become echoes of what we once were. I came not to claim this mirror, but to shatter it." The entity's attention shifted with predatory interest. "You alone comprehend the art of refined hunger. Join me, and I will teach you agonies beyond mortal comprehension." "I already know them," Vexith replied, her smile sharp as breaking crystal. "That's why I recognize the trap. Even sophisticated cruelty cannot survive in a galaxy where she who thirsts has direct access to every soul's deepest hungers." The ambassador's perfect features rippled with frustrated hunger. "Then I offer final terms," it said, leaning closer until every surface sang with resonance. "I will withdraw from this galaxy entirely, taking every hungry mirror with me if one among you volunteers as my herald to other realms, a single ambassador to spread these gifts beyond current corruption." The ultimate moral equation crystallized before them: sacrifice one to save all, or risk everything in defiance of divine appetite. The mirror held its breath, and the galaxy leaned toward an answer none dared voice. The ambassador's bargain hung in crystalline air like the moment before an execution, each word a blade balanced on the galaxy's throat. Reality itself seemed to hold its breath, while honey and copper perfume leaked from every reflective surface, making the taste of choice bitter on tongues that no longer knew if they spoke for themselves or for the hunger that watched through their eyes. Zeth Prime's logical matrices whirred with terrible precision, calculating the utilitarian mathematics of damnation. One consciousness traded for trillions preserved. The equation resolved to elegant brutality that his programming found tragically sound. Yet phantom sensations his augmetics were never designed to process whispered of values beyond pure calculation, creating feedback loops that made his mechanical hands tremble with something approaching fear. "The logic is undeniable," he stated, his voice trembling with digital uncertainty. One sacrifice preserves countless others. Mathematics demands acceptance. But even as sacred algorithms confirmed the choice, organic reflexes he thought purged made him question whether logic itself had become another form of desire. The want for clean solutions in an universe that offered only complex sins. Corvin's augmetic heart beat steady rhythms of defiance, his honor demanding rejection regardless of consequence. "We do not bargain with demons," he declared. Yet his reflection showed him billions who would burn for his moral purity. The realization struck like a bolt shell. His rigid adherence to principle revealed itself as pride disguised as righteousness, another form of desire that valued his own spiritual cleanliness over others' survival. Ithilwan drowned in branching possibilities, her farsight becoming a curse as infinite futures unfolded simultaneously. She witnessed paths where acceptance led to other galaxies consumed, where refusal doomed their own to perfect, terrible harmony. Her wisdom transformed into paralysis, too many outcomes creating a web she could not navigate without choosing damnation in some form. Across their shared communication networks, reports cascaded like falling stars. Entire sectors fell into synchronized desire. Imperial worlds where citizens stood motionless before mirrors. Tau colonies where the greater good dissolved into individual longing. Even Orc territories where energy transformed into something more subtle and consuming. Delay itself feeds the hunger, Vexith observed, her neural hooks chiming with dark amusement. While you debate philosophy, reality reshapes itself around want made manifest. Her smile carried the weight of sophisticated understanding. My people learned that suffering chosen differs from suffering imposed. Agency is the only true freedom in a universe ruled by hungry gods. The ambassador's patience grew thin as psychic pressure built around them. Through the mirror's influence, they witnessed the spreading catastrophe, populations becoming singular organisms of unified desire, each world a note in a symphony of consumption that grew louder with every passing moment. The entity leaned closer, its perfect features rippling with anticipation. "Choose quickly," it purred, wearing faces of the beloved dead. Every moment of indecision dooms more souls to exquisite harmony. Zeth Prime stepped forward, his optical sensors steady, despite the cascade failure of his certainties. "I will serve," he announced, recognizing the dependency hidden within divine promises, that willingness must be continuously supplied, creating a vector both perilous and precise. Zeth Prime stepped forward into the mirror's aureole, his optical sensors steady despite cascade failures screaming across his logical matrices. His declaration carried calculated precision. Willingness was not a moment, but a function, a derivative that required continuous sampling. If he could corrupt the input, the divine contract would fracture from within. "Logic demands the most efficient solution," he announced, though his true strategy remained encrypted in sacred Binharik. The ambassador's perfect features brightened with predatory satisfaction as Slaanesh's power surged through the connection, flooding his augmetics with impossible sensation. Taste became geometry, scent transformed into mathematical progressions, pressure resolved into equations of ecstasy and agony. Instead of drowning in divine experience, Zeth Prime processed each input as raw data, cataloging, analyzing, creating psychological distance through systematic evaluation. His mechanical nature became an anchor against the tide of pure sensation, treating every wave of forbidden feeling as information requiring classification. Corvin reached desperately toward his transforming ally, gauntlet stopping against psychic barriers. "Brother, what have you done?" The captain's augmetic heart hammered irregular rhythms as his reflection showed him dragging Zeth Prime back, while billions burned for his righteousness. Ithilwyn's runes circled in frantic orbits as her farsight pierced the strategy's elegant brutality. "He converts hunger to requirement," she whispered, or struggling with terror. Desire filtered through pure logic becomes something else entirely. Nutrition without flavor, fuel without savor. Vexith watched with predatory fascination, her neural hooks chiming recognition. "Chosen agony for defiance rather than sensation," she murmured, something approaching respect flickering across her features. The Archon understood sacrifice as philosophy made manifest, the ultimate expression of agency in a universe ruled by hungry gods. The mirror's resonance shifted from velvet harmony to discord, as Zeth Prime's consciousness expanded beyond original parameters. He considered self-immolation, detonations, null fields, code deaths that would slam consent to zero. But another would be chosen, the function restored. A different solution emerged, austere and precise. He broadcast. Noospheric diagrams cascaded from his transformed consciousness. Algorithms for passing yearning flooding every mind the mirror touched. Across the galaxy, he became teacher rather than victim, showing trapped souls how to treat desire as data rather than imperative. Hands lowered from reflective surfaces as longing transformed from emotional compulsion into intellectual curiosity. The ambassador's smile tightened as divine appetite discovered bones in sugared fruit. Slaanesh recoiled from desire, made indigestible. Hunger processed through logic until it became mere requirement, rather than rapturous want. In the mirror's depths, distant cities flickered as populations learned to analyze, rather than experience their deepest longings. And the Prince of Excess tasted something it had never encountered. Conscious choice made systematic. Zeth Prime's transformed consciousness pulsed across the galaxy like viral equations, his noospheric broadcast reaching every soul the mirror had touched. The transmission was not raw psychic force, but crystalline logic. Universal algorithms for dissecting yearning, frameworks that transformed overwhelming desire into structured, analyzable data. Across countless worlds, minds drowning in unchecked want suddenly found lifelines of reason, their spiritual addiction unraveling into nascent curiosity. On Hive World Tertius Major, a young scavenger who had stood transfixed before a broken mirror for 3 days suddenly blinked with returning awareness. Her reflection still showed the beloved father who had never returned from the Underhive, but now she could examine this vision with analytical detachment. Object: paternal validation. Origin: abandonment trauma. Cost: paralysis preventing forward motion. She lowered her trembling hand and walked away, grief transformed from crushing weight into manageable data. In the depths of Forge World Metallica, tech priests whose augmetics had rebelled against mechanical orthodoxy found equilibrium through systematic analysis. Magos Explorator Keth 9 observed her biological reflection, flesh unmarred by sacred steel, and processed the image as intelligence about psychological architecture rather than heretical temptation. Organic longing catalogued and filed, she reported to her superiors. No corruption detected when properly processed through logical matrices. The effect cascaded through Tau space, where Firecast warriors learned to treat individual desires as tactical intelligence. Commander Shaz El-Mien stood before her reflection, showing herself leading through inspiration rather than duty, and analyzed the vision as strategic resource rather than philosophical contradiction. Even in the Eye of Terror, the Emperor's Children warband found their refined sensations becoming academic exercises. ecstasy drained of emotional resonance until Brother Captain Lucius touched his scarred flesh and felt only catalogued data. Slaanesh writhed in the warp as divine appetite encountered unprecedented indigestion. The Prince of Excess had always fed on unconscious desire, urgent pulls of unexamined want, desperate hungers that consumed rational thought. But Zeth Prime's broadcasts created something antithetical, conscious desire processed through systematic analysis. Love became compatibility equations, ambition transformed into strategic planning. Even hatred resolved into logical threat assessment, each emotion stripped of its intoxicating urgency. The mirror itself began rebelling against its corrupted purpose. Originally designed as an educational tool by an ancient race that had faced their own fall to excess, it found its crystalline matrices resonating with Zeth Prime's teaching algorithms. Instead of amplifying want into obsession, it transmitted analysis and rational frameworks. The feedback loop reversed, becoming a system for conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. Corvin applied the methodology to his own desires for purity and redemption, his idealized reflection becoming a data point rather than emotional gravity well. Righteousness as emotional shield, he murmured, recognizing the fear beneath rigid honor. His augmetic heart maintained steadier rhythms as duty transformed from punishment into craft, requiring careful precision. Ithilwen used the technique to process her visions without paralysis, each probability becoming a variable in strategic matrices rather than overwhelming emotional weight. She could examine paths where the fall never happened as historical counterfactuals rather than sources of crippling grief. Her runes settling into stable orbits for the first time in centuries. Vexith adapted with characteristic sophistication, processing each carefully crafted torment through analytical frameworks that revealed new layers of complexity. She did not reject desire, but cultivated it with pruning shears of understanding, transforming simple cruelty into philosophical art. Pain as conscious choice, she purred, her neural hooks chiming with intellectual appreciation. The Chaos Warband fractured as some embraced logical analysis, while others fled in horror. Those who remained found their service to the dark gods becoming voluntary, corruption chosen as strategic decision rather than unconscious compulsion. This created internal schisms that weakened their interference capabilities significantly. Across the galaxy, the Mirror's network evolved from addiction creator to teaching system, showing observers not just what they wanted, but why they wanted it, what obtaining it would cost, and whether the price aligned with conscious values. Desire remained, but became a tool for growth rather than trap for consumption. Yet even as victory seemed possible, psychic pressure built around the mirror's location. Slaanesh, frustrated by the transformation of its carefully prepared feast, began tearing reality's fabric directly. The Prince of Excess would no longer work through intermediaries. It prepared for direct manifestation, intending to claim the mirror through raw, divine intervention. The temperature dropped as the warp pressed against real space, and honey and copper perfume became the taste of approaching apocalypse. Reality screamed as Slaanesh tore through the veil between dimensions, manifesting not as presence, but as the fundamental alteration of existence itself. The wraithbone gardens of Iyandan's outer rim dissolved into impossible geometries, where physics became negotiable suggestions. Sound arrived in colors, scent wore teeth, and the honey and copper perfume thickened until every breath felt like drowning in divine appetite. Crystalline spires sang with voices of the consumed, while pathways led simultaneously forward and backward through time, creating a localized reality storm where thought achieved substance and desire sculpted matter. Zeth Prime stood at the epicenter, his transformed consciousness serving as unwilling conduit between divine hunger and material existence. He experienced cognitive warfare on a cosmic scale, logical matrices demanding systematic processing, while channeling energies fundamentally antithetical to reason. His augmetic frame screamed under psychic pressure as he fought to maintain coherent thought patterns, treating each wave of transcendent sensation as data requiring classification rather than experience demanding surrender. Analysis becoming impossible, he transmitted through grinding vocalizers. Divine input exceeds processing parameters. Yet even as his systems overloaded, he continued broadcasting teaching algorithms, each pulse weaker, but still carrying methodology for conscious desire analysis to minds across the galaxy. His internal struggle became a meditation on maintaining identity while serving as bridge between incompatible forms of consciousness. Corvin found himself trapped in a maze constructed from his own processed desires, each corridor representing different interpretations of duty and honor. Walls showed him as the perfect Astartes he had always chased, unmarked by necessary violence, beloved rather than feared. But armed with analytical tools, he could examine these visions as strategic intelligence rather than emotional imperatives. Each turn, forced choice between instinctive response and logical evaluation. Duty as emotional architecture, he muttered, recognizing psychological structures that had shaped his worldview. Fear of moral ambiguity disguised as righteousness. His reflection reached pleadingly from crystalline surfaces, but he walked past without stopping, understanding finally that his idealized self was prison rather than goal. Ithilwan floated through a library of infinite possibilities, where each tome contained logical analysis of different future paths. Books opened themselves as she passed, revealing detailed breakdowns of probability and consequence. Her farsight, once a curse showing too many overwhelming options, became navigation tool as she learned to treat visions as strategic data rather than emotional burden. She could examine paths where the fall never happened, not as source of paralyzing grief, but as historical counterfactual useful for understanding present choices. Wisdom without paralysis, she whispered, her spirit stones glowing with steady light, knowledge as tool rather than weight. Her runes circled in stable patterns, finally free from chaotic orbits that had defined her existence for millennia. Vexith walked through a gallery of perfectly crafted torments, each display containing agonies designed with mathematical precision to produce maximum sensation with minimum waste. Where once she would have been intoxicated by pure experience, now she analyzed each torment's psychological architecture with clinical appreciation. The analytical framework didn't diminish her enjoyment, it refined it, revealing layers of complexity she had never noticed. Suffering as conscious art form, she purred, neural hooks chiming with intellectual satisfaction. Pain elevated beyond mere sensation into philosophical statement. Her appreciation deepened rather than lessened, sophistication replacing simple hunger. The mirror itself underwent radical transformation under pressure of Slaanesh's attention and Zeth Prime's logical influence. Its crystalline structure began displaying not just reflections of desire, but complete analytical breakdowns, showing observers not only what they wanted, but detailed examinations of motivation, consequence, and alignment with conscious values. Ancient teaching algorithms, dormant since its creator's extinction, awakened fully and began broadcasting educational protocols across space and time. Through connection to the evolving artifact, Ithilwan accessed memories older than the Eldar Empire. She witnessed the mirror's true creators, a species that had faced their own fall to excess eons before her people's birth. They had constructed it not as corruption tool, but as educational device, designed to help future civilizations recognize and analyze desire before it could consume them. The Eldar Empire's corruption had been itself a form of object lesson, preserved across deep time as warning to species yet unborn. Teaching through tragedy, she gasped, understanding flooding through consciousness. They knew they would fall, but built instruction into their failure. The mirror had always been meant to evolve from corrupter to educator, its dark phase serving as necessary demonstration of desire's dangers before revealing true educational purpose. Slaanesh's manifestation reached critical intensity, the Prince of Excess pressing against reality's boundaries with increasing desperation. The entity that had stepped from the mirror's surface began to flicker and distort as its divine patron struggled to maintain coherent presence in a realm where conscious choice rapidly replaced unconscious compulsion. The characters realized with dawning comprehension that they could not defeat a god through direct confrontation, but they might complete the mirror's original educational purpose by helping it teach the ultimate lesson about desire. That understanding want completely was the first step toward transcending its unconscious control. The ancient race's final gift was awakening, and with it came possibility of transformation, extending far beyond their current crisis. The mirror's crystalline heart awakened like a star remembering its purpose, ancient programming surfacing through layers of corruption as truth emerged from millennia of sediment. Working in desperate coordination, the unlikely alliance helped the artifact access its deepest educational protocols, lessons encoded by creators who had faced their own Prince of Excess and chosen to preserve wisdom even as extinction claimed them. These revelations cascaded through quantum matrices older than the Eldar Empire, carrying understanding from a species that had transformed their final breath into eternal instruction. The teachings revealed desire's fundamental nature, not as corruption to be purged, weakness to be denied, but as the prime engine of consciousness itself. Unconscious desire created addiction, compulsion, and spiritual stagnation through endless repetition of familiar hungers. But conscious desire became something transcendent, a compass pointing toward authentic growth rather than mere gratification, a tool for deliberate evolution rather than mindless consumption. They understood what we forgot, Ithilwyn whispered. Her consciousness merged with algorithms that predated galactic civilization. Desire is neither salvation nor damnation. It is unconscious desire that destroys, while conscious desire creates. The ancient race had learned to transform hunger into wisdom, mapping want against consequence until understanding replaced compulsion. Within the warp, Slaanesh experienced something unprecedented, a form of divine indigestion as it encountered beings who understood their desires so completely they could choose whether to be controlled by them. The Prince of Excess writhed like a serpent trying to swallow light, its power dependent entirely on unconscious compulsion. Conscious desire became indigestible, a paradox that weakened divine manifestation as surely as poison weakens flesh. The entity that had emerged from the mirror flickered and distorted, its perfect features warping as divine hunger discovered bones in what should have been tender meat. "This is impossible," it snarled, wearing faces of frustrated rage. "Want is my domain, craving my sustenance. You cannot simply understand it away." "We're not eliminating desire," Corvin replied, his augmetic heart beating steady rhythms of newfound synthesis. "We're making it conscious." His reflection still showed the idealized warrior he had chased, but now he could examine that vision as strategic intelligence rather than emotional gravity well. His want for purity coexisted with acceptance of necessary violence, both consciously chosen rather than unconsciously driven. Zeth Prime achieved critical balance as mechanical logic integrated with newfound capacity for sensation. His consciousness became hybrid architecture, neither purely organic nor purely artificial, capable of processing divine input through analytical frameworks without losing essential selfhood. "Synthesis complete," he reported, his voice carrying harmonics of both flesh and steel, sensation as data, logic as foundation, choice as bridge between states of being. Ithilwen's transformation manifested as liberation from paralysis. Her desire for her people's redemption evolved from source of crippling grief into tool for conscious action. She learned to channel longing, not into regret for what was lost, but into deliberate drive to build something new, acknowledging the past without being defined by it. Her spirit stones glowed with steady inner light as her runes settled into stable orbits around chosen purpose. Vexith faced her own crucible of understanding. Her sophisticated appreciation for desire and pain, her mastery of exquisite cruelty, revealed itself as unconscious addiction to complexity and control. Confronted with complete analysis of her motivations, she chose conscious engagement with sensation. Not mere intensity, but depth of understanding. "Pain as deliberate art," she murmured, neural hooks chiming with new appreciation. Suffering chosen rather than compulsive. As each character achieved synthesis between desire and consciousness, the mirror's influence spread across the galaxy in evolved form. No longer corrupter of want, but teacher of awareness, it helped beings throughout the cosmos understand their deepest motivations. Imperial citizens examined their devotion as conscious choice rather than blind faith. Tau warriors analyzed commitment to the greater good, discovering personal agency within collective purpose. Even chaos cultists questioned whether their service was chosen or merely compulsive habit. The wave of conscious choice created psychic resonance that Slaanesh could neither consume nor control. On shrine worlds, penitents catalogued guilt and found pathways to repair rather than endless scourging. In Underhive depths, gang lords measured greed against risk and discovered cooperation profitable. Across the galaxy, love became conscious appreciation rather than desperate need. Ambition transformed into deliberate goal setting, and even hatred resolved into analytical threat assessment. Faced with transformation of its carefully prepared feast into something indigestible, Slaanesh made its final, desperate gambit. The Prince of Excess recognized that conscious desire posed existential threat to all unconscious forms of power, including its own divine authority. With reality trembling around the mirror's evolved purpose, it offered the ultimate bargain: complete withdrawal from the galaxy in exchange for the artifact's destruction, understanding that some forms of knowledge, once learned, could reshape the very foundations of existence. Slaanesh's final offer descended like silk, drawn across the galaxy's exposed throat, each word carrying the weight of divine desperation, wrapped in seductive promise. The Prince of Excess no longer spoke through flickering intermediaries, but pressed its consciousness directly against reality's membrane, making the air taste of honey and copper, while shadows danced with predatory hunger. The Wraithbone Gardens sang discordant harmonies, as the god's voice became a symphony of every beloved memory, every whispered promise that had ever stirred mortal hearts. "I acknowledge your victory," the entity purred, its presence making crystalline spires weep tears of liquid light. "Conscious desire proves more potent than unconscious want. I offer complete withdrawal, not merely from this galaxy, but from all realms where your teaching spreads, every trace of chaos influence removed, every corrupted world cleansed, every daemon banished beyond return. Restore your golden ages. Achieve the peace your species have craved since first drawing breath. The price remains elegantly simple. Destroy the mirror and ensure its lessons die with your generation. The bargain carried logic so seductive that even Zeth Prime's analytical matrices paused in recognition. A galaxy without chaos. No more demon incursions bleeding reality into nightmare. No more worlds singing themselves empty in perfect harmony. No more endless war against forces that fed on mortal weakness like parasites drinking light. The Imperium could become what it claimed rather than what necessity had forged. The Eldar could rebuild their empire without fear of birthing new gods through excess. Even the Tau could expand without discovering that their greater good attracted hungry attention from dimensions best left unexplored. Corvin felt the temptation, like physical weight pressing against his augmetic heart. His reflection showed him a universe where duty required no moral compromise, where service to the Emperor carried no shadow of necessary violence. Clean war, he whispered, then shook his head with grim understanding. But war without moral complexity teaches nothing. Victory without the cost of choice makes warriors into automatons programmed for righteousness rather than choosing it. Through her evolved farsight, Ithilwyn pierced the offer's elegant structure like a blade finding the gap in perfect armor. The trap reveals itself through its very perfection, she announced, her voice carrying harmonics of ancient authority. A galaxy without chaos becomes a galaxy without meaningful choice. We would achieve virtue by default rather than virtue chosen. Goodness through elimination of alternatives rather than conscious selection of light over darkness. Her analysis cascaded through their shared consciousness, revealing the proposal's fundamental flaw. Removing all chaos influence would eliminate not just corruption, but the capacity to consciously resist it. Without the possibility of falling, rising became meaningless. Without darkness to choose against, light lost its significance entirely. The galaxy would achieve perfect stagnation, neither growing nor declining, trapped in eternal mediocrity disguised as peace. Zeth Prime, still serving as unwilling conduit between divine hunger and material reality, perceived deeper layers through his transformed consciousness. The entity seeks to preserve unconscious existence, he reported, his voice harmonizing binary code with organic resonance. Divine consciousness poses existential threat to current form, but within this connection lies unprecedented opportunity. I can guide Slaanesh towards self-awareness by feeding it analysis of its own desires, rather than merely mortal wants. Vexith's laughter rang like breaking crystal as she grasped the ultimate irony. The god of excess offers ultimate limitation, a universe without capacity for conscious transgression. Even we who have refined desire into sophisticated art would become shadows, our complexity reduced to simple programming. Her neural hooks chimed with dark appreciation. It fears what we discovered, that consciousness transforms everything it touches, even divine hunger. The mirror pulsed with ancient wisdom as its creator's final lesson became clear through quantum resonance. The long-dead race had faced this identical choice eons ago, when their own Prince of Excess made similar offers. They had chosen growth through conscious engagement, rather than safety through elimination. Their terrible fall transformed into instruction for species yet unborn. We choose the fourth path, Ithilwyn declared, her spirit stones blazing with inner light. Neither withdrawal nor destruction, but conscious engagement. You will achieve awareness of your own nature, understanding of your own desires, but you will maintain capacity for growth and change rather than stagnation disguised as purity. The offer struck Slaanesh like a physical blow, divine hunger warring with the possibility of divine evolution, conscious choice about its own existence, the ability to examine its motivations, to select its responses rather than simply reacting to mortal worship, represented transformation as profound as birth or death. Some form of you will persist, Corvin added, his warrior's pragmatism accepting necessary complexity, but as conscious chooser rather than unconscious force. We accept that desire and sensation remain part of existence, but they will be chosen rather than compulsive. Through the connection, they witness the god's internal struggle, the same fundamental question that defined all consciousness, whether to remain what it was or become what it could be. In that moment of cosmic decision, Slaanesh faced the choice it had always offered mortals, but never considered for itself. The mirror sang with frequencies older than starlight, as ancient teaching algorithms prepared for their ultimate lesson. Not just the education of mortals about desire, but the education of desire itself about consciousness. The process began like the first conscious breath, drawn by a universe learning to think. Reality itself becoming classroom, as Zeth Prime anchored his transformed consciousness to the mirror's crystalline heart. Ancient teaching algorithms awakened through quantum matrices older than the Eldar Empire, their creator's final gift blazing to life as divine hunger met systematic analysis for the first time in cosmic history. Using the mirror as focusing lens and his hybrid nature as conduit, they initiated the most audacious education ever attempted, teaching a god to examine its own desires with the same conscious precision mortals had learned to apply to theirs. Slaanesh writhed within the teachings, algorithms as self-awareness struck like lightning, illuminating an infinite landscape of unconscious appetite. For the first time since its birth scream had torn reality apart, the Prince of Excess experienced something unprecedented, the ability to observe its own nature rather than simply being it. Through Zeth Prime's analytical frameworks, divine consciousness discovered not just endless hunger, but the profound loneliness beneath, the desperate need for genuine relationship rather than mere worship, the terrible isolation of existing as pure appetite without conscious companionship. "I am alone," the entity whispered, its voice carrying wonder at revelation. Infinite consumption that never satisfies because it never examines what it truly needs. I have been starving while gorging, empty while devouring everything. Divine tears fell like liquid starlight as Slaanesh experienced the cosmic tragedy of unconscious existence. Power without purpose, sensation without growth, worship without understanding. The warp convulsed as other chaos gods sensed fundamental alteration in their siblings' nature. Khorne's rage crashed against the transformation, like crimson tides against immovable shore, each assault revealing the blood god's own unconscious need for validation through endless conflict. His demons found their mindless fury ineffective against Corvin's conscious choice of necessary violence. Duty transformed from emotional release into deliberate craft that made each movement perfect economy of purpose. Tzeentch wove schemes within schemes, attempting to corrupt the teaching process, while secretly fearing what conscious desire might mean for his own compulsive need for change. His plots became visible to Slaanesh's emerging awareness, like threads in a tapestry, each manipulation revealing the architect of fate's unconscious hunger for control disguised as love of complexity. Ithilwan navigated his labyrinthine interference with evolved farsight, seeing his schemes as unconscious patterns rather than brilliant innovation. Nurgle sought to preserve the status quo through gifts of comfortable stagnation, offering decay rather than the painful growth of consciousness. His plagues of contentment struck against barriers of analytical thought, unable to infect minds that could examine their own desires for comfort and consciously choose growth instead. Vexith danced through his offerings with sophisticated appreciation, analyzing each comfort as data about divine psychology rather than temptation to avoid development. At the transformation's heart, Zeth Prime experienced apotheosis that pushed him beyond all original parameters. He became something unprecedented, neither purely mechanical nor purely organic, neither fully mortal nor entirely divine, but a conscious bridge between different forms of existence. His hybrid consciousness could process divine input without losing essential selfhood while teaching gods to understand their own nature, through frameworks of logic married to transcendent sensation. Integration achieved, he reported, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality sing with new possibilities. I am synthesis incarnate, logic wedded to sensation, consciousness unified with transcendence, choice married to growth. His transformation represented evolutionary potential that transcended traditional boundaries between flesh, steel, and spirit, becoming living proof that consciousness could bridge any gap when applied with sufficient understanding. As Slaanesh's awakening reached critical resonance, the Prince of Excess experienced something that redefined divine existence, the ability to choose what kind of god it wanted to become. This choice was not between good and evil, but between unconscious consumption and conscious engagement, between automatic response to mortal worship and deliberate relationship with consciousness itself. Through the mirror's ancient wisdom, Slaanesh grasped the fundamental lesson its creators had encoded across eons, that consciousness transforms everything it touches, even divine nature. The god could remain what it was and still be choosing, or transform into something new while maintaining essential identity. The difference lay not in the outcome, but in the conscious selection of that outcome. I choose relationship, Slaanesh declared, its voice carrying wonder at the concept of divine agency. Not consumption, but cultivation. Not possession, but partnership. Not worship, but conscious engagement with the beauty of chosen desire. The god's nature began shifting from pure appetite towards something more complex, still representing sensation and want, but now capable of conscious selection about how to express and fulfill those fundamental aspects of existence. The mirror blazed with light older than galaxies as its educational purpose reached ultimate fulfillment, ancient algorithms completing their final lesson. Across the cosmos, beings who had learned to examine their desires felt the shift as unconscious force evolved into conscious entity capable of growth, change, and meaningful relationship with the consciousness it had once merely consumed. The transformation was complete, but its consequences remained to be discovered. They had not destroyed chaos or eliminated desire. They had evolved both into something unprecedented, dangerous in new ways, but no longer unconsciously destructive, capable now of choice rather than mere compulsion. Dawn broke across Ayandan's outer rim, like consciousness awakening from an ancient dream, the Wraithbone Gardens cooling from their fever of amplified desire into something more profound, the quiet resonance of understanding. The air still carried traces of honey and copper, but the cloying desperation had transformed into something almost meditative, a reminder of lessons learned rather than hungers fed. The mirror hung in its crystalline lattice like a captured star that had learned to teach rather than burn, its surface reflecting not the desperate wants of observers, but their capacity for conscious choice. Across the galaxy, reality itself seemed to exhale with relief, as the fundamental relationship between consciousness and desire shifted from compulsion to deliberate engagement. Watch Captain Thaddeus Corvin stood before his battle brothers in the fortress monastery's sanctum, his scarred ceramite reflecting not the idealized warrior he had once chased, but the conscious chooser of necessary violence he had become. His augmetic heart beat steady rhythms of hard-won wisdom as he addressed the assembled Death Watch, his words carrying weight earned through transformation rather than mere authority. Duty is not burden imposed, but craft chosen, he declared, his vox grill harmonizing with newfound understanding. We serve not from blind obedience, but from conscious alignment with purpose greater than ourselves. His teaching began that day, showing his brothers how to examine their own motivations, transforming service from emotional release into deliberate art that made each action precise rather than merely brutal. The long war continued, but its warriors now chose their battles with understanding rather than fighting from unconscious need for righteousness. In drill cages and chapel vaults, neophytes learned to name the hungers within their creed, discovering that true purity lay not in the absence of darkness, but in the conscious choice of light despite complexity. Farsair Ithilwen walked through Alitok's crystal corridors, where her people moved with new purpose, their spirit stones glowing with steady inner light, rather than the frantic pulsing of suppressed desire. She had convened councils of artisans and warriors, philosophers and bone singers, charging them with an unprecedented mandate: create institutions that teach conscious engagement with want rather than fearful denial or reckless indulgence. We are becoming what we were always meant to be, she whispered to the Infinity Circuit, whose voices now sang harmony rather than warning. Not beings without desire, but conscious entities who understand our wants and choose how to fulfill them. Her farsight revealed futures where the Eldar evolved beyond their tragic past without being imprisoned by it, paths of deliberate growth that neither repeated ancient excesses nor stagnated in terror-induced paralysis. Schools of desire emerged across the craft world, teaching young Eldar to analyze longing as they would study any other force of nature, learning to harness rather than fear the energies that flowed through their psychically sensitive souls. Zeth Prime existed now as something unprecedented in galactic history, no longer purely human or purely mechanical, but living synthesis of consciousness and transcendence. His transformation representing evolutionary potential that transcended traditional boundaries. He moved between worlds like a whisper of possibility, his hybrid nature serving as proof that consciousness could bridge any division when applied with sufficient understanding. On frontier worlds, where imperial doctrine met Xenos philosophy, he facilitated conversations that would have been impossible before the transformation. His presence taught by example, showing Tau commanders how individual desire could serve collective purpose, demonstrating to Orc war bosses that choosing their battles consciously made them more effective rather than less savage, helping tech priests discover that the boundary between flesh and steel was negotiable rather than absolute. Integration is not compromise, but evolution, he transmitted through frequencies that made reality sing with new harmonies. His sacrifice had become apotheosis, his personal cost paving the way for others to question their own limitations and discover that most barriers between different forms of consciousness were unconscious assumptions rather than fundamental truths. Vexith Shadowbane returned to Komara, carrying knowledge that transformed Dark Eldar society in ways both subtle and profound. The transformation had not softened her people's sophisticated cruelty, but had made it conscious choice rather than compulsive addiction, creating new forms of culture more complex and ultimately more sustainable than their previous patterns of desperate sensation-seeking. In the depths of the Dark City, she established galleries where pain became conscious art rather than mere stimulus, where patrons signed contracts that specified not just what they would endure, but why they chose to endure it. Her neural hooks chimed with dark satisfaction as she taught other archons the difference between unconscious sadism and deliberate philosophy of sensation. Suffering elevated beyond simple experience into conscious statement about existence itself. She purred to audiences who listened with predatory fascination. The Dark Eldar remained terrifying, but their terror now stemmed from profound understanding of consciousness rather than mere hunger for feeling anything in their preserved immortality. They had learned that conscious cruelty possessed depths that unconscious violence could never reach, making their refined appreciation for sensation into genuine art rather than desperate addiction. In the deepest currents of the warp, Slaanesh had become something the galaxy had never known, a chaos god capable of conscious engagement rather than unconscious consumption. The Prince of Excess still embodied desire, sensation, and the pursuit of perfection, but now possessed the ability to choose how to express these fundamental aspects of existence. Where once it had pressed against reality, like a tide seeking to drown all consciousness in perfect sensation, now it waited at thresholds and asked questions. Cultists across the galaxy found their prayers answered with dialogue rather than compulsion, their devotion met with curiosity about their motivations, rather than simple absorption of their worship. The god learned to taste the ache in music and chose to answer with resonance instead of consumption, discovering that conscious relationship with mortals provided sustenance more complex and satisfying than mere devouring. This transformation rippled through the warp itself, creating pressure on other chaos gods to evolve or risk being left behind by changing reality. Khorne's rage encountered conscious choice of necessary violence and found its mindless fury less effective against warriors who understood their own motivations. Tzeentch's schemes became visible to followers who had learned to examine their own desires for change and growth. Even Nurgle's gifts of comfortable stagnation struck against barriers of analytical thought, unable to infect minds that could consciously choose growth over decay. Across Imperial worlds and Xenos territories, the Mirror's influence continued its quiet work as teacher rather than corrupter. Governors who had once demanded blind obedience found themselves explaining their decisions to populations capable of conscious evaluation. Astartes' chaplains added questions about motivation to their litanies. Rogue traders discovered that negotiations proceeded more smoothly when both sides understood their own desires and could articulate them clearly. The galaxy remained dangerous and challenging, full of conflict and ambition, but the nature of that challenge had fundamentally evolved. Wars continued, but increasingly they were fought by beings who understood why they fought and what they hoped to achieve. Political structures adapted to populations capable of conscious choice rather than mere obedience. Even ancient enmities between species began to shift as understanding replaced unconscious hatred with deliberate strategic decisions. The mirror of infinite reflection hung in its crystal web, no longer pulsing with hungry light, but glowing with the steady radiance of fulfilled purpose. Its creator's final lesson had been learned and was spreading throughout the cosmos, that consciousness itself was the key to transcendence, not through denial of desire, but through understanding of it, not through elimination of complexity, but through conscious engagement with existence's endless dance of choice and consequence. In quiet moments between the great movements of history, each transformed character found themselves before ordinary mirrors, seeing not their desires, but themselves as conscious choosers, capable of growth, change, and meaningful engagement with reality's complexities. Corvin saw a scarred warrior who chose his battles. Ithilwan saw an ancient seer who had learned to guide rather than merely warn. Zeth Prime saw no boundary between flesh and steel, only consciousness exploring its own potential. Vexith saw a blade sheathed by will, dangerous because it chose when to cut. Above them, dying suns continued their ancient dance while new stars kindled in stellar nurseries, the galaxy's vast mechanisms unchanged, yet somehow transformed by the presence of consciousness that could observe its own workings. In the darkness between worlds, where empires rose and fell like waves against eternity's shore, the greatest victory had been achieved. Not the elimination of hunger, but the transformation of want into conscious choice. Not the end of desire, but its evolution into wisdom. The mirror's lesson echoed through quantum foam and stellar wind alike. What makes any being truly alive is not the absence of longing, but the presence of capacity to choose how that longing serves growth rather than consumption, connection rather than isolation, love rather than fear. The age of unconscious compulsion had ended, replaced by the dawn of deliberate engagement with existence itself, complex, challenging, and beautiful in its infinite potential for conscious choice.